The acrid, unmistakable bite of smoke, thick and choking, was the first brutal alarm. Elias Thorne, a man whose 72 years had been lived in rhythm with the seasons and the land, sat bolt upright in his ancestral four-poster bed. The scent, sharp and alien, was an unwelcome, aggressive intruder in the cool pine and cedar-scented air of his sprawling ranch house. His heart, a steady, reliable metronome for over 7 decades, hammered against his ribs with a sudden, violent urgency. Outside, the pre-dawn sky, usually a serene canvas, slowly revealing its tapestry of emerging stars, pulsed with a malevolent, unnatural orange glow that silhouetted the familiar gnarled shapes of the ancient oaks surrounding the homestead. These were trees that had witnessed generations of Thornes live and die on this land. He threw on his worn denim jacket over his flannel pajamas, his bare feet finding his scuffed leather work boots by ingrained lifelong habit. Each heavy step he took across the polished pine floorboards towards the large bay window in the living room was laden with a dreadful, suffocating premonition. His weathered hand, calloused from a lifetime of ranch work, trembled slightly as he pulled back the heavy linen curtain. And then he saw it. The west pasture, the historic heart of Thorncrest Ranch, where the magnificent old barns and essential outbuildings had stood for over a century and a half, was a roaring, incandescent inferno. Flames impossibly high licked at the dark belly of the night sky, devouring seasoned timber, precious history, and generations of accumulated memory with equal terrifying ferocity. His main stables, the old smithy where his grandfather had forged tools and told stories, the meticulously preserved carriage house his great-grandfather had built with his own hands, all were engulfed, consumed by a monstrous, insatiable hunger. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in Elias's chest, a sound of profound, visceral grief, almost instantly being consumed and transmuted by a cold, simmering, diamond-hard rage. "They actually did it," he murmured, his voice raspy dry as the kindling his barns had become. The words were barely audible, almost swallowed by the distant, sickening crackle and roar of the fire, a sound punctuated by the occasional explosive pop of collapsing structures. The damn arrogant, short-sighted fools. Thorncrest Ranch was infinitely more than just land and buildings to Elias Thorne. It was the very essence of his blood, the legacy carved out of the rugged, unforgiving wilderness by his determined great-grandfather, Jedediah Thorne, 5 generations ago. Thousands of acres of rolling golden hills, valuable timber, stands that had been sustainably managed for a century, and rich, verdant pasture land nestled in a fertile valley. A valley that was now slowly, reluctantly being encroached upon by the relentless, sprawling growth of the nearby town of Harmony Gulch and its increasingly officious, power-hungry homeowners association. The HOA, a relatively new and, in Elias's considered opinion, parasitic entity in the grand, sweeping scheme of the valley's long history, had recently begun to flex its newly discovered muscles. Its voluminous, often contradictory regulations were seeping outwards from the manicured confines of its newer subdivisions like a blight attempting to homogenize the diverse historic landscape into a bland, monotonous palette of identical beige houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and uniformly spaced, unnaturally pristine fences. Elias, with his sprawling, unapologetically working ranch, its fences weathered by time and utility rather than dictated by aesthetic committee, had become a particular festering thorn in their collective, meticulously organized side. His property, due to an archaic and frustratingly ill-defined zoning overlay dating back to the county's early haphazard expansion days, technically and absurdly fell under the HOA's purported purview, a geographical anomaly they had recently, and with escalating aggression, decided to enforce with the zeal of newly converted fanatics. Elias Thorne was a man of quiet, deeply ingrained habits and even deeper roots. He lived simply, his considerable wealth, not ostentatiously displayed in flashy cars or grand mansions, but woven into the very fabric of the land itself, in the health of his award-winning Hereford cattle, the richness of his soil, the careful stewardship of his forests. It was also embedded in the intricate, often unseen network of trusts, endowments, and charitable foundations his family had astutely established over the decades. The Thorne Family Foundation, primarily funded by vast tracts of prime Thorne family land, granted to the county for perpetual lease timber rights. Watershed protection limited public recreation with its substantial annual disbursements, discreetly managed by a board of trustees. Elias, quietly but effectively influenced, provided a very significant, though largely unacknowledged, portion of Harmony Gulch's annual operating budget, a crucial financial reality apparently lost on, or perhaps conveniently ignored by the current HOA board. That board was led by its pugnacious, ambitious president, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood, a second-rate developer with a slick, predatory smile, a too-loud tie, and eyes that never seemed to focus on anything beyond a potential profit margin or a perceived slight viewed Thorne Crest, not as a priceless historic landmark and a vital piece of the valley's heritage, but as an untidy, inconvenient anomaly. Its rustic split-rail fences, its roaming cattle, its very existence as a working agricultural enterprise were an affront to his grandiose vision of a premier, master-planned luxury residential paradise. The trouble, as it so often does, had begun insidiously with money, or rather, the demand for it. An exorbitant, almost laughably inflated sum for HOA dues was suddenly levied against Thorne Crest. The accompanying letter cited a litany of alleged infractions, non-conforming fencing material, the weathered cedar rails, silvered by time that had stood sentinel for 50 years or more, unregulated and unsightly livestock presence, the magnificent Hereford cattle that were the ranch's lifeblood and reputation, and failure to adhere to approved landscape aesthetics. The natural wildflower-strewn meadows Elias carefully preserved as habitat for local wildlife and pollinators, instead of the chemically treated water-guzzling monoculture lawns favored by the HOA. Elias, through his sharp, no-nonsense lawyer, Eleanor Vance, a woman whose family had served the Thornes for 3 generations, had calmly and methodically pointed out the historical precedents, the ranch's pre-existing legally protected agricultural use status, and the highly questionable legality of applying suburban cosmetic bylaws to a working, productive agricultural enterprise. He had, as his family had always done, offered to pay a modest traditional county land use, tax reflecting the ranch's agricultural status, not the inflated residential rates the HOA sought to impose. Blackwood, incensed by this perceived defiance, had responded with escalating hostility, a series of increasingly threatening letters, and thinly veiled warnings delivered through intermediaries. The final demand letter had arrived like a harbinger of doom just 3 days before the fire. It was curt, arrogant, dripping with contempt, and laced with a palpable, thinly veiled menace. Failure to remit the outstanding balance of 28,743 52s for accrued dues, penalties, and administrative fees within 72 hours of the date of this notice will result in the Harmony Gulch Homeowners Association pursuing all necessary and available legal and extra-legal actions to protect the property values and aesthetic integrity of the Harmony Gulch community. We trust you will make the prudent decision, Mr. Thorne, and avoid further unpleasantness. Prudent. Elias had snorted the sound derisive in the quiet of his study. He'd crumpled the letter into a tight ball, the thick, creamy paper protesting in his grip, and tossed it contemptuously into the cold fireplace. He'd then instructed Eleanor to file a formal legal challenge against the HOA's demands and a separate harassment complaint against Silas Blackwood personally. He knew Blackwood was a bully, a blowhard, a man driven by greed and a petty lust for power. But he hadn't truly believed, not in his deepest, most cynical heart, until he saw those monstrous flames devouring his heritage, that the man was capable of such malignant, cowardly destruction, or of hiring those who were. The mournful rising and falling wail of approaching sirens, agonizingly slow to arrive given the ranch's long, winding, and poorly maintained private access road, another point of contention with the HOA, who wanted him to pave it to community standards, finally pierced the night's cacophony. Volunteer firefighters from Harmony Gulch, their faces grim and soot-streaked in the hellish flickering light of the blaze, battled the inferno with a grim determination, but it was clearly tragically a losing fight. The old dry timber of the barns, seasoned by a century and a half of relentless sun and biting winter winds, burned like so much tinder and unstoppable conflagration. By the time the false dawn began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gray and reluctant pink, all that remained of the historic heart of Thorne Crest Ranch were smoldering skeletal ruins, twisted heat-warped metal roofing, and the ghostly blackened silhouettes of heavy stone foundations. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the acrid, pervasive stench of ash despair, and something else. Something that smelled sickeningly of accelerant. Sheriff Brody, a weary good man Elias had known since Brody was a scrawny boy, stealing apples from the thorn orchards, surveyed the scene, his weathered face etched with trouble. "Looks like deliberate arson, Elias," he said, his voice low and gravelly, kicking gently at a blackened, dented canister, half buried in the still-hot debris. "Found a couple of these near the main barn, smelled distinctly like gasoline or some other accelerant. I reckon," Elias said, his voice flat, utterly devoid of inflection, his gaze fixed on the utter devastation before him. His prize-winning bull, King Solomon, thankfully had been in a separate, newer, fire-resistant steel corral further from the main outbuildings, along with most of the breeding herd. But a few of his finest, gentlest prize-winning heifers and his 2 best quarter horses, stabled in the main barn as they always were gone. The loss was a raw, physical ache deep in his chest, a searing pain that went beyond monetary value. These were animals he'd known, cared for, respected. "Any ideas who might do something like this, Elias?" Brody asked, though his eyes flickered meaningfully towards the distant, pristine, insultingly untouched rooftops of the Harmony Gulch HOA developments, shimmering in the early morning light. Elias met his old friend's gaze. "I might have a few, Sheriff," he said slowly. "But ideas, as you well know, aren't evidence. Not the kind that holds up in court anyway." He knew the local volunteer fire department, brave as they were, lacked sophisticated arson investigation capabilities. He knew the under-resourced and often overworked county sheriff's office would struggle to mount a proper, thorough investigation, especially against a man like Silas Blackwood, who was influential in town. His money and influence spread around like manure. An investigation, Elias suspected, could easily get bogged down, lost in a morass of paperwork, local politics, and conveniently missing evidence. He would have to find another way. Over the next few days, a period that felt like a lifetime of grief and simmering fury, Elias moved with a quiet, deliberate, almost preternatural purpose. He arranged for the respectful, dignified burial of his lost animals on a quiet knoll overlooking the valley, his sorrow a cold, hard, unyielding knot within him. He met with Eleanor Vance, his instructions precise, his voice calm, but underscored with an iron resolve that brooked no argument. The Harmony Gulch HOA, through its smirking president Silas Blackwood, issued a public statement expressing its deepest sympathy and profound regret for Mr. Thorne's tragic loss. They even had the audacity to offer a generous donation to a hastily established fund for rebuilding, a gesture so transparently hypocritical, so dripping with insincerity, it was almost laughable. They vehemently and predictably denied any knowledge of or involvement in the unfortunate accident. Elias ignored them. He ignored the whispers, the pitying glances, the crocodile tears. His focus was elsewhere, on a strategy as old and deeply rooted as the Thorne family itself. He had Eleanor draft a series of carefully worded, legally airtight letters. These letters were not addressed to the HOA, nor to the editor of the local Harmony Gulch Herald. They were addressed by registered, hand-delivered mail to the discreetly appointed, highly influential trustees of the Thorne Family Foundation, and concurrently to the key county administrators who oversaw the master agreements for the Thorne family land grants. The letters were deceptively simple, almost laconic, citing a long-dormant, almost forgotten clause in the original Thorne Family Foundation endowment charters penned by Jedediah Thorne himself in the late 19th century. Should the duly constituted civic authorities within the County of Harmony fail to uphold the peace, security, and lawful rights of the Thorne family or their designated properties and interests within said county, or should justice be denied or unreasonably delayed in matters pertaining to the same, all discretionary disbursements from the Foundation's land lease revenues shall be suspended forthwith without further notice until such time as these fundamental guarantees of civic order and legal remedy are demonstrably and satisfactorily restored. It was an archaic, almost feudal-sounding clause, a relic from a wilder, more uncertain time in the valley's history. It had never in living memory been invoked, until now. Elias considered for a fleeting moment sharing his plan with Eleanor. He could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that he was too old, too grief-stricken, to fight such a ruthless opponent as Blackwood. He'd almost said to her, "Perhaps I am too old for this fight, Eleanor. Perhaps it's time to let go." He wanted her to think he might be considering retreat to lower expectations, even her own. Let them all underestimate the old man. It would make the eventual strike all the more effective. The effect of the letters was not immediate, not a thunderclap, but more like a slow-acting systemic poison, seeping gradually but inexorably into the financial bloodstream of Harmony Gulch and the surrounding county. The Thorne land grants, established by Jedediah Thorne with remarkable foresight, leased vast tracts of undeveloped prime Thorne family land, timber forests, watershed areas, grazing lands, to the county for carefully managed forestry, vital watershed protection, and limited low-impact public recreational use. The substantial annual revenues generated from these leases, meticulously managed by the foundation, were funneled directly into county coffers. This money was earmarked for a vast array of essential public services, everything from road maintenance and school funding to library services, park upkeep, and with a bitter, savage irony that was not lost on Elias, the very infrastructure development grants that had subsidized much of Harmony Gulch's recent aggressive expansion, including the roads, sewers, and utilities for the newer HOA developments that Blackwood championed. Within 2 weeks, the county treasurer, a perpetually nervous, balding man named Jenkins, began noticing alarming irregularities in the expected quarterly disbursements from the Thorne Family Foundation. He made a few discreet, then increasingly frantic calls. He was met with polite, infuriatingly vague responses from the foundation's administrators citing ongoing administrative reviews, pending comprehensive audits, and unforeseen complexities in disbursement protocols. Within a month, the steady, reliable flow of Thorne grant money, the lifeblood of the county's budget, had dwindled to a mere trickle. Then it stopped, completely. The first public sign of deep trouble was the abrupt, unexplained halt to the long-planned, much-needed resurfacing of County Road 7, the main arterial route into Harmony Gulch. This was followed swiftly by the unexpected announcement of drastically reduced hours at the county library, then a sudden, panicked freeze on all new school equipment purchases and hiring. Ugly rumors, fueled by fear and misinformation, began to circulate throughout the valley. County supervisors held a series of emergency closed-door meetings, their faces growing longer and grimmer with each passing day. No one in county government, it seemed, could understand why the money, the ever-reliable Thorne money, had suddenly, inexplicably dried up. The Thorne grants had always been there as constant and dependable as the seasons, a bedrock of the county's financial stability for nearly a century. Silas Blackwood, initially smug and publicly dismissive of the Thorne Crest Ranch fire, now found himself facing a new, far more threatening crisis. The HOA's ambitious, much-publicized plans for a lavish new community center and Olympic-sized swimming pool complex, projects heavily reliant on county matching funds derived almost entirely from the now-vanished Thorne grants, were suddenly indefinitely on hold. His carefully constructed image as a visionary leader, a bringer of prosperity and progress, began to tarnish. Residents in his developments, who had bought into his promises of ever-increasing amenities and property values, started complaining loudly about deteriorating county services, potholes in the roads, and the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of their promised paradise. The carefully constructed, glossy facade of Harmony Gulch's burgeoning prosperity began to crack, revealing the precarious foundations beneath. Elias Thorne remained on his ranch, a silent, watchful sentinel. He oversaw the slow, painful, meticulous process of clearing the charred debris, his face a granite mask of stoic endurance, betraying nothing of the calculated storm he had unleashed. He said nothing publicly. He granted no interviews. He waited. He knew the pressure was building inexorably. He knew that eventually desperation, then anger, then fear would lead them to seek answers, to demand accountability. And he knew with a certainty as old as the hills surrounding his valley where that search would ultimately lead them. The emergency town hall meeting was packed to the rafters. The air in the aging, slightly shabby Harmony Gulch Community Center, the old one, not the fancy new, now aborted one Blackwood had promised, was thick and heavy with a palpable miasma of anxiety, frustration, and rising anger. County Manager Patricia Holloway, a competent but increasingly overwhelmed administrator, stood at the makeshift podium, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled her notes. She was trying with little success to explain the inexplicable catastrophic budget shortfall to a restless, mutinous crowd. "We are facing an unprecedented financial crisis," she announced, her voice amplified by a crackling microphone, trembling slightly despite her efforts at composure. "For reasons we are still struggling to fully comprehend, the expected disbursements from the Thorne Family Foundation land grants, which, as many of you know, constitute nearly 40% of our county's entire discretionary operating budget, have been suspended." A shocked, disbelieving wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the hall. 40%. It was a death blow. "Suspended? What does that mean?" a woman cried out. "Why, we need answers." "Bean," another man shouted from the back, his voice laced with panic. Silas Blackwood, seated in the front row with his stony-faced HOA board members, looked distinctly uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in his folding chair. He had built his power base, his entire reputation, on extravagant promises of unending growth and ever-increasing property values, all implicitly underwritten by the comforting, unquestioned assumption of continued county largesse, fueled by the Thorne grants. "What does this mean for our schools?" Patricia, a teacher in the audience, demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "For our roads, for the fire department. We don't know for sure why this has happened." Holloway admitted, her composure visibly crumbling. "The foundation trustees have been remarkably opaque. They cite complex administrative reasons and refer vaguely to potential breaches of long-standing covenant agreements." Just then, as if summoned by the very mention of covenants, the main double doors at the back of the hall creaked open. A path seemed to clear instinctively, a ripple of anticipation and apprehension spreading through the crowded room as Elias Thorne, flanked by his lawyer, Eleanor Vance, walked slowly, deliberately down the central aisle. He wore his usual clean but unpretentious rancher's attire, denim shirt, worn leather vest, boots still dusty from the ranch. He carried no weapon, no papers, only the immense intangible weight of his family's history and his own quiet dignity. Yet his presence seemed to fill the room, to suck the very air out of it. A profound, expectant hush fell over the assembly. All eyes were on him. He reached the front of the hall, stopping a few feet from the podium, and turned slowly to face the sea of anxious, upturned faces. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, not strident, but it carried a resonant weight of authority, a quiet power that cut through the tense silence like a honed blade. "Ms. Holloway." He began, his gaze steady and unwavering, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, sweeping across the room before settling on the county manager. "Perhaps I can shed some light on your comprehension difficulties regarding the foundation's recent actions." He held up a single charred piece of timber, rescued from the ashes of his barn, a piece of wood his great-grandfather had hewn. It was small, but in his hand it seemed to possess an immense symbolic power. Holloway stared at him, momentarily speechless, her mouth slightly agape. Silas Blackwood, who had been attempting an air of bored indifference, stiffened abruptly, a flicker of genuine, undeniable apprehension, no fear, finally registering in his shifty eyes. Elias held the charred wood aloft for a moment. "This," he said, his voice resonating with controlled emotion, "is all that remains of a barn that stood for 150 years, a testament to honest labor, to a family's commitment to this land. The Thorne Family Foundation," he continued, his voice as even and implacable as the plains stretching beyond the valley, "was established by my great-grandfather, Jedediah Thorne. Its primary purpose, beyond providing for the modest needs of his descendants, was to ensure that this county, this valley, this land that he loved, remained a place of law, of order, of justice, and of mutual respect among its citizens. The land grants, the source of your county's prosperity, were a gift, Ms. Holloway, a generous gift. But they were and have always been a conditional gift, conditional upon the county and its constituted authorities upholding its end of that sacred covenant." He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air, letting their profound implications sink deep into the collective consciousness of the room. A few weeks ago, as you all know, my historic ranch buildings, the very heart of my family's legacy, were burned to the ground. My livestock creatures I had raised and cared for were brutally killed. An act of malicious arson, as determined by your own Sheriff Brody. An act of calculated terrorism, Ms. Holloway, designed to intimidate to silence, to drive out an old man who dared to question the overreach and the avarice of an increasingly arrogant and tyrannical homeowners association. His gaze, like a branding iron, shifted pointedly to Silas Blackwood, who visibly paled, a sheen of sweat suddenly appearing on his florid brow. When such a heinous act occurs, Elias went on, his voice dropping slightly, yet gaining intensity. And the perpetrators, those who ordered it and those who carried it out, are allowed to believe they can act with impunity when the safety and property of a citizen, any citizen rich or poor, old or new, are so blatantly, violently violated, then the covenant, that sacred trust between my family and this county, is broken, shattered. And when that covenant is broken, Ms. Holloway, the Thorne Family Foundation, is not only permitted, but is honor-bound, obligated by the very letter and spirit of its founding charter, to suspend its support, to cease funding those who would allow such injustice to fester. A collective audible gasp went through the room. It was followed by a stunned, horrified silence as the full devastating weight of his pronouncement crashed down upon them. Understanding and a dawning, sickening terror spread across their faces like a physical wave. One woman in the crowd, Mrs. Albright, a long-time resident whose family farm bordered Thorne Crest, cried out, "Oh dear God, we live by Thorne's grace." All this time, Eleanor Vance, who had been standing quietly beside Elias, now stepped forward. She held not a sheaf of papers, but a single ancient-looking, leather-bound ledger, Jedediah Thorne's original foundation charter. "Ladies and gentlemen," she stated, her voice crisp, clear, and professional, cutting through the rising tide of murmurs, "Mr. Thorne speaks the precise truth as stipulated in Article 7, Section 3 of the Thorne Family Foundation Charter, dated October 12, 1888. She opened the ledger to a marked page. "We also have compelling evidence." She continued, her gaze sweeping over the HOA board members before settling on Blackwood with laser-like intensity, including sworn affidavits from concerned individuals, damning financial records, and recordings strongly suggesting a systematic pattern of harassment, intimidation, and extortion, originating from within the leadership of the Harmony Gulch Homeowners Association, specifically targeting Mr. Thorne and Thorne Crest Ranch, culminating in the catastrophic arson of his property. These actions, we will contend in forthcoming civil and we trust criminal proceedings, were motivated by Mr. Thorne's courageous refusal to submit to unlawful and exorbitant fee demands and his vocal opposition to Mr. Blackwood's environmentally damaging development plans. She looked directly, unflinchingly at Silas Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, your homeowners association's financial records, which we have obtained through discovery, show 3 highly irregular cash payments totaling $15,000 dispersed from an unbudgeted special projects contingency fund in the week immediately prior to the fire at Thorne Crest. These payments were made to 3 individuals with known local reputations for, shall we say, problem resolution of a less than savory nature, 2 of whom have prior arson convictions. Can you explain those expenditures to this community, Mr. Blackwood? Can you explain them to the sheriff? Can you explain them to a grand jury?" Blackwood leaped to his feet, his face a mask of contorted fury and ill-concealed panic. He knocked over his folding chair with a clatter. "This is an outrage, a preposterous fabrication, slander, and lies. We had absolutely nothing to do with that fire. It was probably faulty wiring. The place was ancient. This old man is a vindictive relic. He's trying to blackmail the entire county. He's holding us hostage." He whirled to face the crowd, his voice rising to a desperate shout. "He's doing this to protect his own selfish interests, to stop progress, to keep Harmony Gulch stuck in the past. My actions, everything I've done, has been to protect your property values, to enhance this community, to bring prosperity." He then jabbed a finger towards Elias. "Security, remove this man. He's disrupting a public meeting. He's making threats." 2 hapless volunteer deputies near the door took a hesitant step forward, looking utterly uncertain, but before they could move further, a roar went up from the crowd. "Let him speak," someone yelled. "We want to hear Thorne," another shouted. "Blackwood, you answer the lawyer's questions." The tide of public opinion, already wary of Blackwood's arrogance, was turning decisively. The deputies froze. "Blackmail, Mr. Blackwood." Elias's voice, when he spoke again, was as cold and sharp as a shard of winter ice. "I am merely stating the facts and the unavoidable consequences of broken faith. The Foundation's funds, the lifeblood of this county, will remain frozen indefinitely until several non-negotiable conditions are met to my complete satisfaction." He held up 3 fingers. "First," his voice rang out clear and strong, "the arsonists who destroyed my heritage and those who paid them are identified, arrested, prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and imprisoned for their crimes. No plea bargains for the architects of this outrage. Justice must be seen to be done. Second," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "the Harmony Gulch Homeowners Association, from its own funds and assets, will finance the complete meticulous reconstruction of my barns and outbuildings to their original historical specifications, using period-appropriate materials and craftsmanship at whatever the cost. Given the extensive damage, the rarity of the materials, and the specialized skills required, I anticipate that cost will be considerable. Perhaps triple, even quadruple what a standard modern construction project would entail. Your aesthetic integrity comes at a high price, Mr. Blackwood, when applied to another man's legacy. And third," his voice softened almost imperceptibly, yet lost none of its steely resolve, "the Harmony Gulch Homeowners Association under new leadership will issue a formal public and unreserved apology, not to me, for I require none from cowards and fools, but to this entire community. An apology for the damage its reckless, greedy, and criminal actions have caused not just to my property and my peace of mind, but to the financial stability, the reputation, and the very soul of this county. B." He slowly lowered his hand, his eyes sweeping across the stunned, silent faces of his neighbors, the panicked, desperate expressions of the county officials, the utter desolation on the faces of Blackwood's erstwhile supporters. "The choice ladies and gentlemen of Harmony Gulch and Harmony County," he concluded, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of generations, "is now yours. Uphold the law and restore justice, or stand by and watch as this community, your community, withers on the vine, starved of its sustenance due to the unbridled greed, the petty malice, and the criminal arrogance of a few. Choose wisely. The future of this valley depends on it." The fallout was immediate, explosive, and utterly catastrophic for Silas Blackwood and his closest allies on the HOA board. Faced with open, furious rebellion from their own dues-paying residents, the cold, unyielding fury of the entire county leadership, and the terrifying prospect of financial ruin, their authority so recently absolute crumbled like ash. Sheriff Brody's investigation, suddenly imbued with a new ferocious sense of urgency, a wealth of new leads provided by disgruntled former associates of Blackwood, eager to save their own skins, and the full, unblinking cooperation of county and state agencies, moved with astonishing swiftness. Within a single week, the 2 known local troublemakers who had been seen boasting in a downtown Harmony Gulch bar about a very well-paid bonfire job up at the old Thorn place were arrested. Their initial bravado quickly evaporated under skilled interrogation. Their detailed confessions implicated the HOA's thuggish head of code enforcement and community standards, a distant, unsavory relative of Blackwood's, who in turn, staring down the barrel of a long prison sentence, eagerly pointed the finger directly at Silas Blackwood as the one who had conceived, ordered, and paid for the arson. Silas Blackwood was arrested dramatically during an emergency HOA meeting he had desperately and futilely tried to control. He was led away in handcuffs from the very podium where he had so often pontificated, shouting about conspiracies, betrayal, and the injustice of it all, his reign of arrogant intimidation and petty tyranny finally ignominiously over. The Harmony Gulch Homeowners Association, now under new, humbled, and terrified interim leadership, quickly, almost pathetically, agreed to all of Elias Thorne's terms. The cost of rebuilding the historic barns and outbuildings to their original specifications was indeed staggering, as Elias had predicted. It nearly bankrupted the association, forcing the liquidation of several undeveloped land assets and the imposition of substantial emergency levies on their bewildered and furious members, many of whom had been Blackwood's staunchest supporters. They paid it every last cent under the watchful, unforgiving eye of Eleanor Vance and a team of historical restoration experts retained by Elias. The public apology, read by the trembling interim HOA president at a specially convened county meeting broadcast on local television, was abject, thorough, and deeply humiliating. True to his word, once the arrests were made, the guilty parties charged, and the commitments for full reconstruction and public apology were legally binding and irrevocable, Elias Thorne picked up his antique telephone and made a single brief call to the chairman of the Thorne Family Foundation. Within 24 hours, the foundation announced the immediate resumption of its disbursements to Harmony County. The county, shaken to its core but profoundly relieved, collectively breathed a sigh that seemed to echo through the valleys and hills. Its essential services, crippled for weeks, slowly, painfully began to be restored. The new barns at Thorncrest Ranch rose phoenix-like from the ashes. They were faithful, magnificent replicas of the originals, their massive, hand-hewn timbers smelling of fresh-cut pine cedar and the sweet scent of resilience. The community, chastened, wiser, and more than a little awestruck, looked upon Elias Thorne with a newfound profound respect, understanding at last the quiet, unyielding power that lay beneath his unassuming, weathered exterior. He had not sought conflict. Indeed, he had actively avoided it for years. But when it had been thrust upon him, when it had come to his doorstep breathing fire and malice, he had met it not with rage and bluster, but with an unwavering, steely resolve, drawing upon a legacy of strength and foresight they had forgotten, or perhaps never truly known, existed deep within the roots of their shared history. Harmony Gulch changed. It had to. The Homeowners Association, stripped of its most toxic leadership and its financial leverage, became a more subdued, responsible, and genuinely community-focused entity. The county officials, having stared into the abyss of financial ruin, learned a valuable, painful lesson about the true foundations, literal, figurative, and historical, upon which their fragile prosperity was built. And Elias Thorne, an old rancher, with roots as deep and enduring as the ancient oaks on his land, continued to live, as he always had, a quiet, diligent steward of his heritage, a silent, watchful guardian, whose courageous actions had reminded an entire community that justice, like the land itself, was a precious, indispensable thing worth fighting for, and that true, lasting power often resided not in shouted demands or petty regulations, but in the steady, unyielding, principled defense of what is right and true. The Thorne land grants were no longer an invisible, taken-for-granted income stream. They were recognized as a living testament to a family's enduring conditional bond with the community and a potent, permanent reminder that some lines once crossed carried consequences as vast, unyielding, and elemental as the land itself. And sometimes, from the ashes of destruction, something stronger, truer, and more resilient could rise.